So I just want to welcome everybody. My name is Julia Mahoney. I am the Education Program Administrator for Renew Theaters, and this program is sponsored by the Vesta Fund, which allows us to make this free for our members. So we want to welcome members and guests from each of our theaters, the Ambler, the County, the Princeton Garden, the Highway, and the Majestic, who is collaborating on this with us. The Vesta Fund is so thrilled, by the way, to be able to keep these virtual events going. They've provided with us an additional grant to expand the series and to bring in other theaters and more speakers. And this is the official launch of our new Deep Focus program. So we're going to continue our classic film series, but we're also adding other tracks, such as an international series. We have an initial set that will be moderated by an Iranian filmmaker at Temple University, a series on Asian American perspectives by Ann Chang at Princeton University, and a set of discussions on Wes Anderson's film in anticipation of The French Dispatch. So stay tuned for that. Some upcoming events that we have are we have a discussion for Witness for the Prosecution tomorrow evening as more from our Classic Hollywood series. And then next Monday night, we have a talk on Flower Drum Song, which is kicking off our new Asian American Identity series. You can also find past recordings on the Deep Focus website, deepfocus.film. I just want to remind everybody of a couple of different Zoom protocols and question protocols. So we do request that everybody remain on mute unless they are speaking. We will start with presentations by Dina and Erica and then open it up to discussion. But we ask that if you do have a question or comment, that you please use the raise hand feature, which is found in the menu at the bottom of your screen. I will call on speakers. And we will likely open up the conversation to allow people to jump in later. The chat feature will also be in effect, so please use that to discuss any items that are being talked about. It often ends up being a pretty lively sidebar in the chat, and we'll bring in anything of interest into our conversation here. So now I would like to introduce our guests this evening to you. Dina Paulson is a writer and editor and the founder of Aqua Editing, a storyteller for creative thinkers. She is a TV feature writer at Collider, senior writer at Sunrise Digital, and published her chapbooks, Parts of Love, with Finishing Line Press. Her writing also appears in Cine Suffragette, Medium, The Rumpus, Flash Fiction Magazine, Empty Mirror, and on her blog, Walk the Line. Erica Rubine. Erica Rubine has a Ph.D. in Folklore from the University of Pennsylvania and teaches film and media studies at Rider University. She is currently writing a book about Hal Ashby entitled I've Changed, or Turning This Mother Out, the subject I and women in Hal Ashby's films. Under the moniker Esoterica, she hosts the Sonic Bloom on Princeton's WPRB 103.3 FM, where she interviews artists, musicians, authors, and plays a wide variety of music, including punk, garage, psychedelic, post-punk, and jazz. All right, so Erica and Dina, I pass it on to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Erica, and as you can see there, my name's right there. And I have my colleague Will here as well, I see, and who is an incredible host of Blues Off the Record at WPRB in Princeton. So where you can hear all kinds of early and late blues. So, and yeah, all different kinds of spins. Yeah, so I've been talking to Dina, and it's so nice to get to know her as well as we've been talking and preparing for this conversation this evening. Mm-hmm. How many of you are big Back to the Future fans? Well, it certainly has some cult status for sure. And so I think that Dina and I were talking about, and we kind of organized it so that I would sort of kick it off. We had talked about discussing music and then discussing the 80s. So because there's so much to really focus on with this film, we looked at both films, but I think we'll probably primarily look at or talk about 1985, the first film, Back to the Future, but then also, you know, the second one as well in 89. So I was kind of interested in the fact that sort of looking at the shift, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on as well, from 70s films that you mentioned, Julia, Hal Ashby, who is a a director near and dear to my heart. So kind of looking at that shift, and there are a lot of different dovetailing musical and cultural shifts, of course, and political events in the 70s. And I don't like to look at any decade as if sort of, there's a nice box around it, but there are lots of things going on. And I do think about the auteur, and of course, auteur sometimes or often gets related or connected to a male, most often, but there are a lot of women, female directors out there as well. And so, but Hal Ashby, I was just sort of thinking of 79, because I could talk about a lot about Hal Ashby, but 79 being there, and the films of the 70s, a lot of them were kind of thought-provoking films or existential films of consciousness raising or of conscience, I guess you would say, like Coming Home, for instance, was a Hal Ashby film. But then, you can't only say that about the 70s, because of course, 1976, you had Star Wars, and that came out, and that was a big blockbuster. You can even go back to Paramount, and producer Robert Evans and his wife was in, Ally McGraw was in Love Story, which was in its own way a big blockbuster. And so, with disco and punk and all the different kinds of, and stadium rock that was going on in the 70s, there is a shift for sure. In 1976, I was just thinking about, with Back to the Future, the notion of the franchise and the notion of branding and marketing. There weren't a lot of Chauncey Gardner, if you're familiar with Being There, and Hal Ashby, or Harold and Maude dolls, although there might be some great Harold and Maude dolls, but they're, the cult films, and those films alongside disaster films, like Airport 75 or Earthquake, or blaxploitation films. But that 1976, I think Star Wars was so pivotal. Godfather 2, because you have your, Godfather 1 and 2 and so on. But Back to the Future was interesting to me because of the franchising and the branding, if you will. And even I was rewatching the second Back to the Future today, and there was a sort of a product placement of Mattel with the hoverboard, that, you see Mattel everywhere. But for that, part of that franchising, if you will, is that shift in 1982 when video killed the radio star, and you've got MTV and all of that, some would call almost superficial, or the music videos become so important, and you've got the rise of so many people who wouldn't necessarily, some are kind of natural to be out there. Madonna, the Police, I would say, that had some, and the Clash, that were on MTV. But Huey Lewis out of San Francisco was kind of your every guy. He wasn't really somebody, I guess he had sort of those kind of cool looks, but he was really kind of coming from a bar band. But he becomes, in this soundtrack, The Power of Love becomes a huge hit, gets nominated for an Academy Award, and the rest is history. And apparently he didn't really know, or was nervous about, had never written for film. Power of Love was something that was written before, but Back in Time is the other song that is Huey Lewis in the News. And but once he did it, I guess the director put him at ease, and Alan Silvestri did the music, put him at ease, and he said it was a lot of fun. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then Dina and I had been talking about Johnny Be Good, of course, Chuck Berry, who, some people, according maybe to the Rolling Stones, maybe him and Willie Dixon, I'm not sure, invented rock and roll. But so that is an interesting piece there as well. And I read somewhere that Berry had to be paid $50,000 in order for the song to be used in the film, and he only agreed at the very end of the filming. So apparently, dramatically, like maybe the day before or something like that. And of course, Marvin Berry and the Starlighters, Night Train, they perform classic song at the Enchantment Under the Sea dance. Yeah, it's interesting to sort of think about that. And of course, that Enchantment Under the Sea dance is played on November 12th, 1955. And I had read that was it Silvestri or that he who was orchestrating, kind of compiling this soundtrack. He was born 50. He's from Teaneck, by the way. He was in a band called The Herd for a second, up in Bergen County. But that being baby boomers, it was important to sort of go back and cultivate that nostalgic vibe, if you will, of the entire film, because it is about going back to, supposedly simpler times, if you will. So I think that's part of it as well. So, and I think that in a way we can almost kind of parallel if I'm looking at thought-provoking films and existential films of the 70s and then contrasting them with the big franchises that we see, E.T. As well, that there is maybe, Tom Wolfe might say that Bonfire of the Vanities and Wall Street and 80s excess, that there might have been a sense of trying to go back to something after Watergate and recession and all of those things in the 70s. And maybe the franchises were a part of it as well. So I had that to say, just to focus on the music and then sort of contrasting some decades. So Dina, how about you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wanted to say that one of the interesting things that Erica and I discussed is that when we're looking at the soundtrack and when we're looking at exploring the 80s through the films, we're really looking at the 80s vis-a-vis 1955 and then 2015. And then we're also doing it in repeat, since much of the second film is repeating sequences from the first. So one of the things that Eric and I discussed and really enjoyed doing was looking at the soundtrack list from each of the films. Like, for example, the Angel song, what's that beautiful song, Earth Angel, right, which appears in the first film and then is like a beautiful romantic melody that is also in the second film. The Johnny Be Good, also we see Marty McFly do that 2 times, because we also, at least 2 times, but it appears in the second film as well as the first. So I think that what thinking about this repetition led me to think, at least, was that how does what this film does that is unique versus a film, say from the 1980s, like any of the Hughes films, for example, Breakfast Club. Erica just did a great job. Erica did a great job talking about the history and the vibes going from 60s, 70s to 80s. But what do these films that are just focused on the 80s or just focused on the 70s do differently than what Back to the Future does? Because when you're looking at, California 1985, and there's this kind of like free rolling bright moment, and then you're back in 1955 and some things feel kind of stayed and they feel outdated, and then of course 2015 you have like hovercraft, everything's like hoverboard, it's like way more advanced than we actually were in 2015. But that's really interesting if you're holding as an audience in your mind all 3 of those eras, and you're skipping over like tens and tens and tens of years, and you're thinking about like politics, and you're thinking about social manifestations and relationships and social norms, but you're doing all of that in the context of one film. So I think that is something really interesting to look at. Yeah, Eric, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is interesting to sort of think about, and I guess that is we have to talk about time travel, right? And then of course part of that time travel we can get into, which has nothing to do with music, but the Oedipal kind of thread here with his mother, which has been touched on. I think that happens a little bit in 17 again. I think that came out in 2009 with Leslie Mann and Zac Efron, and I don't know, but there are some other films that don't have any Oedipal thing, but like Peggy Sue Got Married. I can think of other films about what could have happened, what might have happened. And in this case, we do see that. Yeah.
No, I was just thinking totally, like I was doing a little more research about Zemeckis, and, he's really hung up on the time thing, right? Because he does Forrest Gump, right, which is a gorgeous, display of what time can do. And then he also does Castaway with Tom Hanks later. Again, he's really fascinated by the way that time moves. And interestingly enough, he makes Who Framed Roger Rabbit in between the first and second Back to the Future, which is like a very, like sexy, corrosive, like anime weird thing, which also has like interesting time elements to it. So and then he makes Romancing the Stone, which is a huge critical hit in 1984. I think that, Erica was also mentioning that Zemeckis, he's of the baby boomer generation. So I think that's also always interesting to look at, especially when, he goes on also to direct the third, film in the franchise. So, clearly, the idea of having an auteur who wants to take a story, over so many years, and really dig into an idea, I think is reflected, I think in the commercial success of the first one, right? 1985, it was the highest grossing film across the world. He did something very different. Erica you've already spoken, Erica, eloquently to the darker films that we had in the 70s that were coming from a sci-fi place, and also just like a war dark place. Like we were also talking about Deer Hunter, for example, before, even Jaws. And
you never talked about
becomes much lighter, right? And then, one of the things from a broader perspective, Erica and I were saying, well, did you like the films, right? And for me, the first film was basically perfect. And the second film was very hard to watch. I felt like it was overplayed and things were made complex. Their friendship, which was so endearing about the first film, even was kind of more harried in the second film. And it was just all about Biff's rage. And I wasn't interested in him. And it just really didn't sit with me. But I think it's interesting to think about the ways that Zemeckis was trying to do something creative and still emotional in the second film. I just don't think he achieved it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Dina was saying she and I have been talking about. Well, I was saying I like the Deer Hunter, Michael Cimino, that you are attracted to films that are about emotion, right, and character development and relationships. And I think my favorite films are ones that get me are ones that have that, like Robert Redford's Ordinary People. I really like because of the acting and Good Will Hunting, Gus Van Sant. I have soft spots for films, and even Gallipoli, Peter Weir, which will tear your heart out. But I really think the character development and it's the relationships that really are important to me. But in Back to the Future, it is more playful, and I think I had mentioned to you, I had said the phrase comfort food. It is like a lot of popular cultural films that become franchised, whether it's Shrek or I don't know, that people want to see the first, they want to see they go back, and it takes us back to a certain time in our lives. So in a filmic sense, even though it's not music necessarily, although I went on YouTube and the people are just adoring with all of the comments about the soundtrack and, all the songs, and really think about them connected to their lives. But I think that that's true for filmically, just thinking about a film located in a certain time. For me, I was saying to Dina, my first date with my high school boyfriend was at the Loma Theater in Point Loma in San Diego, where I grew up, and we saw E.T. and it was in June. I think it was released June 11th, 1982. So I was 16. So there you go. I know exactly when it was. And and of course that summer, I think that's something that we could think about too, that it's summer. Those summer blockbusters this was a summer blockbuster too, Back to the Future. That's something that I can think about. I know that in the first year in college out in Claremont, California, I went and saw in 1985, I saw in February when it came out. I can't believe it came out in February, but I had to look it up. Went and saw with some buddies from my first year there, Breakfast Club. So there we were thinking about Breakfast Club and the music from that as well. And that film has a sort of it's not just a film, it's almost like a sort of emblematic of an era, or it has that kind of, or at least it's attempting to. John Hughes is definitely trying to capture
and
the
what's
ethos of this.
about that point is that, whenever someone comes to a film, they're coming from wherever they're coming from. So if you look at this film, from 1985, people could have seen it obviously as early as 1985, and then from 1985 until today, right? So again, with this idea of the time travel continuum being what the story is about, you wonder how everyone in each, epic can relate to seeing time being played with that way. Like, how does that affect where we are, when we're watching?
I agree. I think that say like even in with The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, you will, see something in say in The Hobbit, for instance, which is kind of a prequel, but there might be some things dropped in that for fans will be, or in Star Wars or in Star Trek, that will be comforting, or almost like an inside joke, or something that will be there in the writing to kind of make you feel a part of that, I guess, a family, if you will. But John Hughes films, even though they're not, like sequels or, part of a series, they have
feel like,
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think it's easy when Eric and I, when we first talked, I think it was easy to say, well, let's look at what the movies say about the 80s. And then I realized, in thinking and really studying the films, that again, you're talking about the 50s and 2015, but then you're also, well, what happened in the 60s and what happened in the 70s to make the 80s be the way they are? And then, God, what about all this invention, that must have happened between 85 and 2015? So in that sense, it's very provocative, right? The film Zemeckis is asking you to read between the lines, and Gail, his co-writer.
Agreed. I think there was something that I wanted to add. I guess we were talking about 80s culture, and I think that you make a valid point about sort of what is he trying to do with, well, because even then in 1985, there's a tendency, or not a tendency, but there can be a slippery slope in thinking that we are so sophisticated and we can see as we're making these films, whether it's Gale and Zemeckis, but we feel as if we're on the cusp of the future, and even though we're located in one little blip of time in this continuum, so that's interesting.
Yeah, and why 1985? I mean, the 70s, coming out of Watergate, the end of the 20-year Vietnam War. I mean, those are very, very heavy, monumental pieces of American history. And, and then towards the end of the 1960s, you have the first Men on the Moon. So there were lots of these big shifts, that were happening. And then when you look at these 80s films that were very popular, Hughes and the like, also Cry Baby, I think with Johnny Depp was around the same time. It feels like, this is like I'm born in 1983. So for me, this is like a pre-Melrose Place, like Beverly Hills 90210 era of 80s. It's this like very, very social. It's like a new pop back then, right? You mentioned Madonna, but everything becomes somehow more saturated in a way when it comes to those tentpole films, at least from Hollywood at that time. And, Zemeckis, he must have, liked the idea of having something that was going to be based in poppy small town California, and from there look back, but that was a decision that he made. I mean, he could have said it in the future, right, or in the past, so I wonder what it was for him, that made him think that the 80s would be a good departure point.
This might be a good time, if you guys are okay, if we open
Absolutely.
it up for more questions. So I just ask everybody to do the raise hand feature, and then I will call on you. And we have William.
Hi. First of all, thanks so much to both Dina and Erica for getting us started with a lot of really interesting jumping off points. One of the things that struck me when I was watching the second movie, which I had not seen, and which I also thought was kind of a mess in some respects, I was left wondering, they have the line at the end of the first movie about, oh, we have to go help your kids. And it seems like they decided that's not what the movie was going to be about anymore at some point during the writing of the second script. So there's this like super truncated version of the movie about helping Marty's kids, but then they just want to get back to rehashing, in a way, the film from, I guess, the first film. There's a way in which it's weirdly nostalgic for the first film already by the time the second film comes back. It is actually trying to bring us back in time, if only like 4 years, or I don't know, 4 or 5 years, whatever the gap was. But what I wanted to think about specifically in the second movie was the alternate version of 1985 and the anxieties that we can read in that. Particularly, there's the sequence, which for me viewed kind of uncomfortably now, where Marty McFly goes to what he thinks is, I think it's what he thinks is his house, and he breaks in and there's a Black family living there now. And it's all kind of compressed what exactly is happening, but the father, after he chases him out, has a line about like, we're not selling, right? So there's kind of I feel like a lot there about this alternate reality, crime-ridden 1985, the potential racial elements of it. And it's all kind of quick in the movie, but I just feel there's a lot to unpack there.
That was a tremendous scene, and I mean that certainly talks about redlining and the racism that still is in America today, and I think another and also I appreciate you bringing up also the what I really call like the Biff horror storyness of the second movie, and I mean it's just like a disgusting like avarice of greed and excess. I mean, it's like a Scarface wannabe thing, right? But he's just such a bad person that it's just so horrible to watch. But I do wonder how aware Zemeckis and the production of the film was of wanting to show what racism was and how true it was. And Erica had mentioned something before about Johnny Be Good, and something I had wanted to say about that scene, which we do see repeated in the second film, is the way in which the film turns around the birth of this awesome funk sound, electric guitar sound, to a white guy who's just not even a musician, like Marty, as if Marty was the one who played that. And I get there's like the time thing and it's funky and weird, but the way the scene plays out, it's Chuck, listen to this person playing this, right, when it's actually Chuck who did that. So, intended or not, that's problematic.
Ida?
Well, the one thing that I thought first was that 85 reimagining was like when George Bailey came back after he discovered that it was perfect. This one guy had taken over the whole town and made it really nasty. But I also thought the original 85 was sort of weird. I live in a small rural town that's sort of stuck in 55, and the loan shark isn't on Main Street. In his 85, the loan shark and they were playing porn movies, it looked like, or something at the local. I didn't understand that, because small town America, that stuff's zoned somewhere else. But when he came back, it was really just like George Bailey going down the street with all the hookers and everything. I thought that was interesting. I think what they were trying to show is that, in terms of race, is that the neighborhood had gone downhill, and that's why Black people were living there. At one point, you saw the name of the development pushed over on the ground. So it was like, well, this nice neighborhood where these white people used to live isn't such a nice neighborhood, and that's why he discovered Black people living there. Not sure what they were trying to get at, but.
Well, that's kind of interesting as well, Ida, in the sense that if you see from the 1985 and then and I totally get that the Pottersville kind of George Bailey going, it's an homage almost to that scene. But about, and I'm spacing out on his name, who becomes mayor, Willie? Is that the name of the character? But just that whole theme as well, from 85 when he's cleaning up in the ice cream parlor or the diner, although in California we call them coffee shops. At least back in the day, they're probably now diners or restaurants.
But notice he was no longer a mayor, he was selling something.
Right.
He was a salesman of some kind, so he'd gone from making maybe a name for
that's right.
politics to making money. He was selling something. Come by one of our 49 local franchises or something like that.
But like, what is Zemeckis trying to say there? And it's almost like he's touching on the surface of things, but doesn't really give us a lot to chew on, I don't think. But yeah, but I thought that was because that scene is so kind of surprising in the 1989 second version about the redlining and harassment. Why do you keep harassing us? Is interesting, but it kind of comes out of nowhere, and then there's no other commentary. So I thought that was kind of, so they could have done maybe more.
Yeah, and maybe there's other sci-fi heads, if that's a term, on the chat who can say more about this. But it doesn't really seem like the film did want to go deep into any of those social moral aspects. So I don't know if that is that a defining theme for those who are like hardcore sci-fi watchers? That's not me. So I don't know if that's something that's kind of like endemic to the genre, that I don't know, like the sci-fi, like the more canonically sci-fi Fantasia elements, are those the ones that are always pushed, and there really isn't as much like social, deconstruction work that's being done in those films?
Beatrice, did you want to speak to that?
Hi, yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to say that I could see that the second movie, well, first of all, the first movie was very much about the difference between the 50s and the 80s and how much his parents' time was definitely not like his time. And with the second movie, I feel like that was more of a time travel movie where they focused on more of the element of actually time traveling, because in the first movie, he only really time travels twice. And then you see Doc Brown go off in the end. And I think the purpose of the second movie was the whole be careful what you wish for, or just the slightest thing you do in the past can be really dangerous to the future. And I think it's also just a reflection on Marty's character arc, because he had the idea in the first place to buy the sports book and have the idea of, I can make a little bit of extra cash. And the whole thing is that the time machine got put into the wrong hands, and all of their consequences were all of their actions led to horrible, huge consequences. And I think that's why, and I think that Biff was maybe a little bit too much of the villain, and it was portrayed as that maybe more than the fact that it was their fault in the first place. But I think that as a movie itself, I personally really enjoyed the second movie, but they're very different types of movies. So people who are huge fans of the first one, I can understand how they're not huge fans of the second one, because they're very different in so many ways. Like, yes, it's the same characters, it's the same, like there's lots of repetitiveness, but at the same time, the whole plot of the movie, the whole theme of the movie is not the same at all as the first one. And I think that when you're making a sequel, you have to be really careful about that kind of a thing, because you can't just kind of make it a repeat of the first movie, but you should also have like its own little like twist to make it more interesting. And of course, it doesn't end off on like a happy ending, like it goes on to the third movie. So I think that when you look at the second movie, like by itself, well, obviously you can't because it's a sequel, but if you look at it like as a movie by itself, I think that it was well done for the kind of movie it was trying to portray, which is more of a time travel movie. And I think that the difference between the two films make it better, honestly, because I feel like if the two films were too close together, they would not be as, it would not feel like a franchise. It would feel more just like this one great movie and then had like floppy sequels. So yeah, thank you.
That's super interesting. Do you think, Beatrice, that like the second film could be a standalone? Like, would you not even see the first one, and would you just want to see the second one?
You know, honestly, if you take into consideration, if you just had new characters, I think that the second film could be a standalone film without all of the stuff, because without all the repetitiveness and all the stuff, it's really just like they go to the future, they leave a time machine in the wrong hands, and things go wild. And honestly, I feel like it would be a good standalone film, but I feel like as a sequel itself, maybe it doesn't really connect well with the first one, but I think that it's not a horrible movie.
Mm-hmm.
We have some people discussing in the chat maybe some other things from the second movie that didn't sit the right way. We had one comment about how maybe the more racist leaning aspects of it reflect the anxiety of the West Coast in that era, but other people are also talking about how the girlfriend gets knocked out and just kind of left in an alley in the second one. And Ida, I know that you had written something about that, so did you want to say something?
Well, first of all, I didn't think they should do that. I was taken aback. I thought, well, is it sort of like, what was the movie with Will Smith, where they sort of, give you the so you don't remember what's happened to you. They were giving her it was Men in Black. But then they just left her in an alley. I mean, I sort of get the wiping of the brain so she didn't remember, but the leaving in the alley, I mean, I guess I sort of thought they're really going to do this to a white girl. I just didn't think that would actually happen, or they felt that 2015 was so banal that nothing would happen to her. I just thought it was weird. And I'm an actress, so what bothered me about the second movie, it was just too broad. Everything was too big. Her breasts were too big. The stupidity was too large. It was like a parody of the first movie.
Yeah,
it seemed to me. Mm-hmm. Now, I like movies, once again, because I'm an actress, a good character development. I'll watch a terrible movie that there's good acting. And I was finding it hard to stick with this movie for a lot of reasons.
William and then Beatrice.
Yeah, I wanted to, this is in a way like a repeat of something I made earlier, but Erica was talking about the birth of the franchise, and I don't know, I mean, this movie, the first movie ends to set up a sequel, right? And I don't know how new that was. And I really felt like leaving the girlfriend in the alleyway was a great illustration of the fact that the character had to go to the future because he goes to the future in the first movie, but they had nothing real. I mean, eventually she becomes important as this device for them to be busy with something while Biff takes the time machine and they don't notice. But it's like they had nothing for her in that part of the script. So they're like, we'll just leave her in an alleyway. So it just looks, I mean, it is really weird if you take it literally, but it just seems like a storytelling decision that, oh crap, she's got to be there because she is, so we've got to recast different actress and we won't really have her do all that much. But then also in the version that I rented of the second movie, they actually had basically a trailer for the third movie tacked onto the end of it, which seemed really weird to me. I don't know if that was aired theatrically, but this is really you can see, every Marvel movie has an after credits scene setting something up now. I feel like you see this in its infancy.
Yeah, that wasn't effective for me. I don't know, William. Did that make you want to see the third? It didn't make me want to see the third. I was like more of the second. Sorry, Beatrice. The second really did not sit well with me.
Beatrice, you said you pretty much agree with what he said. But Cynthia, you had your hand up as well.
Oh, it was, sorry, it was an error. I apologize. I lowered my hand. Thanks.
I just saw Jess's comment, and yes, they were shot back to back, the second and the third, and they saved like $10 million. So that's what I read. So that was interesting.
But I mean, I guess that's something to think about. I mean, production value suffering for fiscal reasons, right? That can't be a scarcity occurrence, but it doesn't, perhaps result in something of quality,
It does look like they're using a totally different set too, based on just the preview for the third one. And it almost seems a slightly random. I know it's 100 years in the past, but it's like, okay, going to his parents and his kids, then they're like, what else can we do?
Yeah.
That reminds me, there was where was it? I think it's LA Curb, or there was some website that was dedicated to all of the sites. So that was really interesting to me to check out. So I think that is an old set, some sort of old Hollywood set, that the Western cowboy, I'll find it, but I think it's like LA Curbside, or, oh, here it is. Because, Pasadena, are there any Californians in here at all? Pasadena has an incredible wealth of arts and craft style homes. The Green Brothers, Green and Green Architects. So you'll see the Gamble House, and then Doc's house in the first film are all in that area. Amazing examples of craftsman style. So that is interesting, but it's this website called la.curbed, curbed.com, and it shows /maps and then Back to the Future filming locations, and it's fascinating, especially growing up in LA and in Southern California, and then living in LA. So it's pretty cool. And the mall, of course, that just feels like California as well. So.
Beatrice?
Yeah, so my opinion about the third film mostly is that I did also think it was kind of random. Like, it had no correlation to who they were, like, as people. But I guess one time in the second movie, Doc Brown said, "Oh, I've always wanted to go to the Wild West," and then they kind of took that and ran with it. But I feel like it was sort of like a, hey, we're a time travel franchise, might as well go to the Wild West, I think that it wasn't a bad movie, but I feel like, again, the connection between the franchise was just a little weird. I think I did like how he got over his whole didn't like being called chicken, but in rewatching the first film, there was never any thing about him being called chicken, and I was really I was surprised about that, because I always in the back of my head I always thought, I was oh, that's just the casual, that's the iconic Marty, don't call me chicken, and then and then rewatching the first film, that never happens, and it's crazy because it's they made up a problem in the middle of the franchise, but if it was always happening in the first film, then it would make more sense to have this grand old oh, he saved his future by not caring what others think anymore. But it was never really a problem in the first place, so I feel that was also really random and never sat well with me. And I think that it was just really random to go to the Wild West. And again, they had the whole with the mother waking him up and he thinks he's in a dream, and like that whole scene. And I think it was like, all right, come on. At this point, like, we know. And so it was just like they always had that kind of scene, but I think that the third movie was sort of out of place. So
There's something mentioned a little bit earlier in the chat, which maybe connects to the Wild West in terms of like fun. But somebody was saying, I think it was Cynthia, how the 80s was just all about fun. Music, TV, and movies were all for entertainment and for escape. And there's this kind of like rom-com aspect to it. Cynthia, why don't you, I'm sure you can word it better than I am.
Oh, no, you're fine. I was just going to add on. So, yeah, it's interesting because, if I think about all the different entertainment modes, I guess, in the 80s, music, TV, movies, I feel like people going to movies at the time were looking for this escape. I don't know that they were, it's interesting. I remember seeing Back to the Future in all three of them and sort of thinking, oh my gosh, the second one seems almost like a clone of the first. And then the third one, because it was so different, it was fun because it was just sort of, it was unique. And I feel like with all the romantic comedies, and then also coming off the heels of Indiana Jones and Star Wars and all those different movies that, you waited in like such, these long lines to get into. And it was just fun. Like you were sitting with friends and family. And like you mentioned, the summer blockbusters. It was, in the movies, like, with MTV and all the music videos. I think people just, like you were mentioning earlier, like coming off of, the 60s and the 70s and these intense decades, I think that the 80s was, it ended up being a reaction to it insofar as it was the complete opposite, just like this really kind of really neat and sort of anything goes, colorful, musical, upbeat, upbeat time where everyone just kind of wanted to participate and and kind of look forward to the future because everything seemed to be like a really neat movie soundtrack everywhere you went. I don't know. I don't know I guess what I mean is when people were going to the movies at the time, I'm almost wondering if they weren't really thinking of the idea of the franchise and how things connected together. I mean, I think it's a really good point, and looking at them now in hindsight, you can, there's so much analysis, and I think it's super interesting to look at it in a connected way. But I almost feel like, going, listening to watching a music video, listening to one, watching different series on TV. I feel like people wanted to see the stars. They wanted to see Michael J. Fox. They just wanted to, oh my gosh, he's in another movie, or oh my gosh, Harrison Ford is in another movie. And they just wanted to go see the people that they liked and just were excited that, something new was on the horizon. I think that's what I was sort of interpreted from the 80s.
If I can just add something quickly, something that Erica and I didn't mention, as far as filmic company, 1989 was also Do the Right Thing, right? Spike Lee's tremendous film that explored racial tension in Brooklyn, right? So, and that was the same year that Back to the Future 2 came out. So I think it is also important to see, what else was happening, with other narrative films, explicitly in race and racial relationships at that time.
Beatrice.
I think you're muted.
Yeah, you're
Beatrice.
muted. Yeah.
Sorry. I wanted to talk about the fact that I think that it's really valid that Cynthia brought that up, because I don't know what it was like to go to the movies in the 80s because I was not born yet. But yeah, so the first time like I saw these movies, I was like 4 or 5. So I really never got the experience of all the people who were actually living in that time. So I think it's very like probably very common to have for like different people of different generations to have different views on like the parts of the movie, and especially how different pop culture is today. And I think that there's also like in pop culture, there's so many references to the first movie of Back to the Future, like in Family Guy and Bob's Burgers, just a bunch of TV shows. And it's just like TV shows that would be for like teenagers. And if those teenagers like haven't seen Back to the Future, they wouldn't really understand like the reference, but it's such a classic movie that people of all ages are like able to enjoy it. And I think that that's really cool. But the difference in viewing because of the difference in like growing up is, I think, really, really valid. Yeah.
I was just going to say, Beatrice, there you are. It's like the Partridge Family or so, I don't know. But Brady Bunch, more like. So yeah, I agree with you that there is that cult status, and then maybe it, the cult status and waiting in lines to get to these films and feeling a part of something I wonder if there's any connection to some of the great cult films that were shown. I would go to midnight movies in the 70s and 80s to see, I don't know, Jimmy Cliff, The Harder They Fall. It could be, a rock film footage, Song Remains the Same, Led Zeppelin, or it could be Rocky Horror Picture Show, which still gets some play. It's almost that season for Rocky Horror to be live productions in Halloween, during Halloween. But so there is that great camaraderie, I think. Or was it Beatrice who was talking about that? Or yeah, okay.
Cynthia?
Yeah, I wanted to add on to something that I said, and then also Beatrice, I guess, with the growing up. I'm thinking that, the 80s was such a decade of romantic comedies. And, we were talking about the John Hughes movies. There was also When Harry Met Sally. There was also, there was a slew of them. And I feel like people, the different decades I know mark different time periods and different, groups of generations' lives, depending on when they come of age. So when they're in high school or college, something, that decade might have, resonated with particular generations. So if they're, in the midst of graduating high school, going to college, graduating from college, these different movies make such an impact and sort of guide them into how they look at relationships and, and just how they might look at life and careers and so forth. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
I was just going to say that, Cynthia, yeah, I agree with you. What's interesting is that my son, who's a sophomore at Temple, film major, loves Back to the Future. So that's it, even though Zemeckis, he even has a school, I think, of, at least a building at USC where he went for special effects named after him, that, does it really stand the test of time, thinking of time travel. But my kid grew up with Back to the Future and still thinks it rocks. And there have been hip hop albums named after Back to the Future. I mean, it is, maybe it's the DeLorean's also kind of a, that statusy 80s aspect as well. So. But I guess it does, yeah, stand the test of time. Or do you think it does? Maybe it doesn't.
I think it does. I think there's also, it's funny, like people associate different events and memories with, aromas and, certain sights or like a little object or something. And I feel like sometimes, and I've always loved Huey Lewis. I've always loved the Back to the Future movies as well. But, sometimes on the, when I'll hear The Power of Love on the radio, or I'll just hear it, or it'll be a background of something. I think the Goldbergs even had it as a little sound in their little soundtrack in one episode. I'm like, oh my gosh, Back to the Future. And then it conjures up all sorts of images and, fun events and so forth. And I think, I think there are aspects of Back to the Future that can stand the test of time. They're little snippets, people have their favorite scenes and so forth, but certainly I think the music does that as well.
Max.
This might be a little bit maybe too broad question because there are many great movie trilogies out there, but where do the hosts think this ranks among the great film trilogies? Or if that's too broad a question, maybe a better question would be, where does it rank among Zemeckis' career? Because for me, his crowning achievement will always be Forrest Gump. But this is pretty close.
I'm sorry, Max. How did you characterize Forrest Gump?
As Robert Zemeckis' crowning achievement.
Yes. Okay. For some reason, my ears, too much rock and roll. Being a DJ, I heard crying shame. So there's a big difference between crowning achievement and crying shame. So I thought I'd just make sure. Forrest Gump. My son loves Forrest Gump as well, and that is full. It's very interesting, and it has a very cool soundtrack as well. So that's interesting. And Who Framed Roger Rabbit? I liked it, but I wasn't. It's very interesting, special effects wise, but it wasn't my. Somehow, it can be where you are in time as well, and you're in how you respond to things. But Forrest Gump definitely captured my imagination. And it was 1984, Romancing the Stone. I went with my parents and I love that film. It's great and it's fun. And they're back together again or working together again, I heard. Did you hear anybody hear that? Kathleen Turner and Michael Douglas? But they're good buddies. So I just saw them featured together in some maybe Vanity Fair article or something. So
Yeah, Max, that's a great question. I mean, since I didn't see the third Back to the Future, I couldn't answer in terms of trilogy, but I think in terms of Zemeckis, I also loved Forrest Gump, definitely. I did really enjoy Castaway, and I haven't seen, I know he did a film, I think called Flight, I think Denzel Washington, Contact, I haven't seen those, but I mean, I really, Back to the Future, I think is now one of my favorite films of all time. I think it's a pretty flawless film. For me, the friendship between Doc and Marty is the heart of that film. And I think that there's so much love that comes from that. I mean, it's actually the frame of the film is how Marty knows Doc and how familiar they are with each other. And I mean, I think for me, it's up there with the emotional resonance of Forrest Gump. So I guess maybe it's kind of a tie at this point.
Fair enough.
And I guess I would just add that to Max, if I think about like Peter Jackson, and I don't even know, can we even compare
exactly
special effects, something like Lord of the Rings, because the first three films I adore and I can watch them over and over again. And they also do have some good character development, and they really, I get a little choked up, there here and there. So that's, I'm not sure if they're just from two different places, I think, special effects wise. So.
This one's much more lighthearted too.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for maybe one more question. one final question percolating out there, something someone has been saving
Mhm.
this moment. Oh, you know what? We'll do two. It's okay. We'll do Max and then Beatrice.
I didn't have anything else.
Oh, sorry, your hand. All right,
No,
Beatrice.
not saying thing on top of my head, at least.
I just wanted to go ahead and mention about how much I loved about the first movie and like the little details that just made it like chef's kiss in my opinion. Starting with when he goes back to the 50s and he's in the tree farm and he runs over one of the trees, and then when he comes back to the present, instead of Twin Pines Mall, it becomes Lone Pines Mall, like Lone Pine Mall, because there's only one tree because he ran it over. And just little things like when he's trying to unscrew a bottle in the 50s and his dad just grabs it out of his hand and opens it with the bottle opener, like, dude, what are you doing? And it's just little things like that. It's like you can tell that the producers and like the directors, like they cared about how much detail was put in the movie and how much just like all the small things, and like Marvin and Marvin Berry, and just like that whole like, you know, the sound you're looking for, try this. Like it's just it's really cool. It's like a little moment for like all the fans to go, oh my gosh, I understand that. So I think that that's a really enjoyable part about the movie. I know that's one of my favorite parts because every time after I see that movie, I'll like immediately start having the biggest nerd conversation with my dad about like, I was like, did you see that part? So I think that's just like, that's one of the greatest parts about this movie is that it's genuine. Well, it's my favorite, honestly, my favorite movie of all time. But I think that the actors were amazing and the way they portrayed the people were amazing. And specifically just like little pieces, like the whole Calvin Klein situation was just hilarious. And I think that it was really executed well. And I think the comedy in all of the movie was just perfect. So, yeah.
All right, guys, I think we're set. Thank you to Dina and Erica so much for hosting and presenting tonight. And thank you everybody for coming, keeping the lively discussion. All right. Hope we see you tomorrow at our next virtual discussion. Have a great evening, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Julia.
Bye.